Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk using the Power Platform to extend finance and operations apps, Part 2, Common Data Service. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams Live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout and at the end of the event. If you would like to turn on closed captions during this event, click on the CC button on the lower right side of your screen and use the gear icon to select your preferred language. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Proffitt, Senior Program Manager, and Jeff Anderson, Principal Software Engineer. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining from. I'm super excited to be here with part 2 of our Using the Power Platform series. For those of you who do not know me, again, my name is Rachel Proffitt. My contact information here on the screen for you. I encourage you to connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or you can follow me on my blog at dynamics365lady.com. So in today's session, we've got some really exciting demos lined up for you, and we're going to be talking about really kind of 3 pillars around the Common Data Service. I'm going to be showing you how to use dualwrite, dataintegrator, and virtual entities together in the same environment in an end-to-end scenario with Powerapps portals, Powerapps model-driven apps, Power Automate, and all of this is built on top of that Common Data Service. We're going to talk about pros and cons, do's and don'ts for each of the different technologies with the Common Data Service and how you use these tools to integrate and build extensions and solutions on top of finance and ops. And we've also got a variety of learning resources for you in the deck, and there's also 2 appendixes at the end of the deck that will be available for you after the session once the recording is available, and I encourage you to take a look at those additional resources that we've compiled for you today. So getting started with the Common Data Service. Many of you are probably already aware that dualwrite, it's been around for a little while now, but it's that tightly coupled bidirectional near real-time integration with finance and operations and your Common Data Service. Virtual entities is the new player to the game, and there's a tech talk coming up in about 2 weeks that's going to deep dive into this topic. I'm just going to be kind of highlighting use cases and talking a little bit about how you use it and when you use it. But these virtual entities put all of your finance and operations data in the Common Data Service. And the dataintegrator is, the oldest player in the game, if you will. And this is our point-to-point asynchronous integration tool. So kind of getting started with the comparison of these 3 tools, the first thing that I want to point out, and if you take nothing else away from this, is none of these tools are replacing anything, right? These tools are all meant to be complementary. So in the demonstration today, you're going to see all 3 of them working together in the same environment. There are definitely some caveats, like when you should use each tool and some scenarios where you would want to make sure that you're not using the tools in a conflicting way. And we'll talk more about that as we really dive in. But when we think about the 3 different tools, there are a variety of attributes and characteristics of these tools that are important to understand. And these attributes will help you pick the right tool and the right technique for integrating or extending your solution. So the first one is speed. With dualwrite, it's near real time. With virtual entities, we are making real-time CRUD operation calls. And the data integrator is a scheduled recurrence. So it's not intended to be used in scenarios where you need near real-time data or near real-time updates. From a methodology standpoint, dualwrite is synchronous and dataintegrator is asynchronous. And you'll notice that virtual entities are marked as not applicable. And this is because virtual entities are not actually an integration technology. Virtual entities, in a oversimplified kind of definition, are just querying the data, and the data actually lives in the source database inside of finance and operations. So we're not actually synchronizing any data with the use of virtual entities. The same thing is true of the direction. So because we aren't copying any data, there's no direction to the virtual entities. But when I use dualwrite, bidirectional means that I can update those records in either finance and operations or in the common data service. But when we think about the data integrator, it is only one directional. For each particular entity that you're working with, you can only synchronize that entity in one direction, either from finance and operations to the common data service or vice versa, from the common data service into finance and operations. When we think about the actual data, and I kind of mentioned this before, with dualwrite, that data is actually duplicated. And the same is true of data integrator. So it'll be important to consider that duplication of data because I'm now storing the exact same data in two different databases, and the database size limits will apply to both of those systems. However, when we use virtual entities, that data will remain in the source system inside of finance and operations. So from a database capacity standpoint, you only need to be concerned with the size of your finance and operations database. From a logic standpoint, there are quite a few differences in kind of how business logic is executed with the three technologies. And this is one of the key decision points or pivot points in your decision-making process when you're deciding which technology to use. So with dualwrite, we have automatic business logic execution, and that business logic actually happens on both sides, both in finance and operations and in the common data service. So for example, if you have a required field in the common data service on a particular entity like an account, that field would be required even when you're updating a customer, for example, in finance and operations. So if that field is not populated or it isn't mapped in some sort of way, the user would actually receive an error message back in finance and operations indicating that that field is required. And the same is true of the opposite with finance and operations. With virtual entities, we do have the ability to call OData actions through like an Azure Logic app or a Power Automate or by writing custom extensions, but it's not an automatic process for that business logic to be executed. And when we think about the data integrator, that business logic sits outside of the data integrator. So the data integrator is really the mechanism for moving the data. And if we have business logic requirements, we handle those outside of the data integrator. There's still certain logic that is validated, like required fields and so on with all of these technologies because we are writing those records back into whatever those backing tables are. So if you have failed to, fill out a required field or you've put an invalid value into a particular field, those types of validations will still occur. From a size standpoint, when you're thinking about the integration or how you're going to be using this extension point, from a dualwrite standpoint, it's using OData, behind the scenes to kind of write those records. And so it works well for single transactions. On the contrary, data integrator is designed and specifically targeted towards those bulk transaction scenarios when we have lots and lots of records that need to be updated. The same is true of virtual entities. If you were trying to use virtual entities to mass update many records, you would likely run into some performance issues, much like you might with dualwrite. And with dualwrite, we typically recommend if you're doing like a large data migration, for example, when you're just getting started with your system, that we usually recommend that you turn dualwrite off while you're doing that in import. Because otherwise it's making, a lot of these OData calls and that performance can be degraded. From a change tracking standpoint, there are some differences as well, and this is important to understand from the common data service side of things. So with dualwrite, an entity actually exists. It is a physical entity inside of the common data service, and we do support the use of change tracking. Change tracking on an entity can enable a lot of different behaviors on an entity in the common data service, including things like audit logging, the ability to have a trigger through Power Automate or Logic apps. It also changes the behavior of how the caching works if you're using that particular entity in a Power Portal, for example. However, with virtual entities, you cannot use change tracking. And so what that means is that we do not have a mechanism to trigger a Power Automate or a Logic app when those CRUD operations occur. One thing to note, though, is that we do have a feature on our roadmap that is up and coming to support the concept of business events in the Common Data Service, much like we do for finance and operations. So today we can't, have a trigger based on a record being created, updated, or deleted in finance and operations. And the same is true of those virtual entities. But with the addition of the new feature that's coming soon with business events for the Common Data Service, you will be able to create those triggers and call those triggers using Power Automate or Power or Logic apps, rather. And the data integrator as well does support change tracking because, again, that entity is a physical entity or a native entity that does exist in the common data service. So these are the features and the considerations that you'll want to make when you think about the business requirements to determine which technology is best for your particular situation. So before I jump into the demo, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to demo in the scenario. So for some background to start out this scenario, in my environment, I have dualwrite configured for the entire order to cash scenario, along with companies, which is syncing over my vendors and customers. And I do have some other entities enabled as well for dualwrite in my environment. I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail on that, but if you do have questions about dualwrite, I encourage you to check out the tech talk that we did on dualwrite, and the link to that is in the resources in the appendix of my deck that will be provided. For this scenario, we're using an end-to-end purchasing or procurement type scenario with an open bidding process. In my environment, I did enable the public sector configuration key, but similar results could be achieved without the public sector key using the basic request for quotation functionality. You would just need to leverage different entities and the buttons, and some of the things are maybe a little bit different when you don't have the public sector configuration key enabled. The other thing to point out is that I started from the partner portal template that is available in Powerapps. And so that is a template that's available that when you start to create a new one, you can just pick that template. Another option that you could use is to start from the supplier management sample portal. That portal is not available directly in Powerapps as a template. However, you can download and install that template for free. It's a solution that you'll need to install in your environment that you can get from GitHub with, without any username or without any I can't think of the word. Anyways, so we start this scenario out by publishing RFQs out to the portal by using virtual entities. So I've enabled a handful of virtual entities in my finance and operations environment and my related common data service. And when I create those RFQs, they automatically appear out in the portal. Then I've got vendors and prospective vendors who can go browse that public portal site and see the details. For my demo, I just built out a very simple page that shows the list of open bids, and you can click to view the details or the lines of each of those bids. On the same page, I also inserted a form to sign up to be a prospective vendor. This would not need to be on the same page, but for simplicity's sake of the demo, I just created a single page. And again, those prospective vendors are a virtual entity. At this point, you could do several different things from your scenario, but for my example and my demo, to help again keep it simple, I'm assuming that the buyer reaches out to that vendor and starts a purchase requisition process. But you could just as easily enable a number of additional entities that allow vendors to sign into the portal and actually create and edit those bids directly on the portal. You could also use the out-of-the-box vendor collaboration portal that supports that functionality as well. So after we have kind of started this process, what I did was I created a model-driven app to make the process for the buyer easier. Let's say my buyers are oftentimes not at their desks and they're using tablets to process you know, a lot of their transactions. So they might be at a trade show, they might be out in the warehouse and need to create those purchase requisitions or purchase orders and so on. So I created a simple model-driven app that allows my buyers to view, create, and update those purchase requisitions. And again, I'm using virtual entities in that model-driven app. For my vendors, I again was using the dualwrite, so the buyer has the ability to edit those vendors or make changes to those, and those directly from the model-driven app, and those changes would come straight through to finance and operations. For the model-driven app, again, I enabled virtual entities for the header and lines of the purchase requisitions and the dualwrite for the vendors. In order to make all of that work, I did have to create some new views and forms, and I'll be kind of talking through that in a little bit more detail. So kind of picking up where that scenario left off from the purchase requisition side, we now need to start processing those approved POs. So those POs would go through whatever workflow process or approval processes that you might have configured in finance and operations. And in my scenario, I'm assuming that we're using a third-party warehouse management system. So I configured the data integrator to push products, purchase order headers, and lines out into my fictitious WMS system. In my case, I'm just pointing it to another CDS environment, but that could have just as easily been a SQL Server or any other data source that the data integrator supports. In my case, the integration is scheduled to run nightly to push those approved purchase orders out to the WMS. And theoretically, I'd also need to create an inbound integration for the warehouse management system to indicate when products are received to post that transaction. And this could be done using a recurring integration with data management, for example, but I won't be showing that as a part of my demo. Once those purchase orders are received, then we start getting those invoices in from our vendors. And so for my example, I'm using a Power Automate that listens for emails or is triggered by emails being received to a specific email address and sends those through to a SharePoint library and uses a Canvas app that has been embedded into finance and operations to process that actual invoice. I'll be sharing a short video of this when we get to that point in the demo, and we'll be diving into this particular piece of the scenario in more detail in a later part in my series when we do the AI Builder. The other piece of this that you could do, and I won't be demonstrating, is the kind of payment to bring the whole scenario full circle. I would have the ability to surface some additional virtual entities out into my portal to allow the vendors to see the invoice details and the payment details once those invoices are processed. And those would require your vendor to be signed up and be you know, authenticated into that portal to see that additional information. So with that particular piece of it, another thing that we could do is use a business event to trigger, to say when that invoice or when that payment is posted, to trigger the system to send an email. So I have set up an example of an outbound Power Automate that is triggered by that business event that I'll be showing you as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over and dive right into this demo. All right. So I am here inside of my finance and operations environment, and where we are going to start off at here is with the, is with the creation of a new request for quotation. So I'm going to go into my all request for quotation page. And I'm going to go ahead and generate a new one. From yesterday's session, I created some Tech Talk stickers. So today I'm going to create some more Tech Talk stickers. Just like normal, I'm going to create this requisition. I can indicate if this is going to be a purchase rec or a purchase order. I can indicate site and warehouse, but I'm just going to accept my defaults here. But the one thing that I do want to select is a solicitation type. So I'll select that and click OK. And then for my example, I'm going to use a category. And then I'll select my procurement category from the drop-down box. So I'm going to choose office and desk accessories. And then in my product name, I'm going to go ahead and type in Tech Talk CDS stickers. I'll tab on over and make sure that we get a quantity here and a unit of measure. I need 10,000 of these stickers because I know everyone's going to want one. And I'll save my record. And then once it's saved, I can go ahead and send and publish. So once I click on send and publish, I'm asked, I haven't assigned any vendors to this. So this is going to be public. Everyone will be able to see this on my Powerapps portal. All right, so now that I have published this purchase requisition, I can go out to my portal, and I'll just go back to the home page. So I created, again, this Powerapps portal starting from the partner portal example, and then started making updates and changes to it. So I've got a home page with some basic information and some links and buttons to become a vendor and so on. But I added a new page up here for the open RFQs. So when I click on this page, it brings me to the new page that I created where I can see that open list of bids. So I can see the full list of all of these RFQs. And if I tab on over to the second page, there you can see my new purchase requisition. And I should have put a document title in here. I didn't when I created it, but I could actually go back and update that on my request for quotation here. So if I wanted to just type something in here, Tech Talk sample CDS, and save this again. When I come back over to the page, if I refresh this, that change will be reflected here in the site. It takes a second, so I might need to refresh it again, but I'd be able to drill into those details either by clicking on the hyperlink or clicking on the view details, and that would open up and show me the lines. I also have the ability to register to become a vendor. And so in this particular case, my open bid list that I created here is view only. But my request to become a vendor is an edit form or a create form. So it allows users to actually type some information in. I'm going to go ahead and create a request to become a vendor here and put in some details here. I'm just creating my request to become a vendor, and when I'm ready, I can submit this. You do have the ability from a Powerapps portal standpoint, since this is a public-facing page, you could set up a CAPTCHA on this so that you don't just get a bunch of hackers like submitting a bunch of random things on your site. So if I go ahead and submit this, Once I come back over to finance and operations, and if I go into, I saved this one to my favorites, to my prospective vendor registration requests, I can see that prospective vendor that I created in the system here. So that request comes through into the system, and then I can use my buttons and my workflows to process that request just like normal. So the next piece of this scenario is really centered around the model-driven app. So I've opened up my model-driven app that I created here, and I've put a number of different things in here. So the first thing I did was I put my vendors in. So in my particular environment, I'm not syncing all of the vendors from all of the legal entities. You can actually see I'm just syncing DEMF and USP2. And I do have the ability to kind of make changes or updates to these particular vendor details. So for example, if I open up this vendor, let's say I want to change this to a different vendor group, I can come in here and change this and say, oh, they're going to be in vendor group 10, or I could update other information on this vendor account. And because I'm using dualwrite, if I save and close here, that update is going to go back and update finance and operations directly. So this will take a second here. While that's kind of thinking, I'll go into, I need to switch companies first. DEMF. Oh, helps if you spell it right. Okay, third time's a charm. DEMF. My company does not want to change. There we go. And then I'll go into my all vendors form. And if we pull up that vendor that I updated, this US 001, you can see that it's now in group 10. Again, if I change it from over here, if I change it back to 50, so if I edit this and I want to change it back to 50, when I save and close this record, so it was set to 50, if I save this and go back into my model-driven app once it's done saving and refresh that page, the change will be effective. So, and that's that bidirectional capability of the dualwrite. So if I refresh this, I should see it go back to 50. So there you can see it's back to 50. So that's the dualwrite, and in my case, right, I enabled dualwrite, and there was already an entity with forms and views, so I didn't have to do anything other than add this entity into the sitemap for my model-driven app. I also put my open bids out there, so you know, the buyers could see those open bids. These are the same entities and the same forms and views that I used on the portal site. So I can double purpose those and surface them on the portal as well as in my model-driven app. But the purchase requisitions is where you know, I really wanted to target allowing my you know, buyers to be able to come out here and very quickly and easily create these. So this is a very simplified view of my purchase requisitions. If I click on one of these, it'll open up the details. You can see the lines on this. So maybe I want to update the quantity on here, so I can click edit and let's update this and say I wanted 100 of these instead of 10. If I save and close this, again, this is a virtual entity, and much like the dualwrite, that change will be effective over here. So the difference is that the data is not actually stored in the common data service. So if I switch back over to my finance and operations environment and go to my all purchase requisitions page, I will be able to see that change on the purchase requisition. So this Tech Talk one that I edited, that quantity will be updated to 100. So there you can see that quantity is 100. And if I want to edit this back, I could change this. Let's just make it 1,000 now, or 10,000. That's fine. And save this record. If I go back to my model-driven app, those changes will be effective here as well. So if I refresh this, there you can see it's 10,000. And that's because this is querying that data real time. So I can make those changes on either side. The key difference between what I showed you with vendors and purchase requisitions is that vendors, the data is duplicated. So it's consuming capacity in both my common data service and in finance and operations, whereas my purchase requisitions are only consuming capacity in finance and operations. And there's only logic or business logic inside of finance and operations for this, whereas vendors have additional logic and functionality in the common data service. All right. So the next piece of this scenario is where I need to start receiving these. And so again, I'm using my my data integration project to integrate that data. So I'm over in the Power Platform Admin Center now, and if you click on that data integration link on the left-hand side, I've created a project here called CDS Tech Talk, where I have set up a couple of different entities and done some mapping in there to indicate what exactly I want to map. And obviously, from a realistic standpoint, you'd want to map a lot more fields than just these 3 fields. But I can very quickly and easily do that by just adding a mapping, selecting that field that I want to map to, and then on the flip side, choosing which field on my destination that I want to map to. And I can update those mapping types. I'll just go ahead and delete that. In my case, I set this up to execute nightly. So if I come over to my scheduling tab, this is where you can see I set this up to run every 1 day at 11:30 p.m. I do have the ability to increase those intervals. It does allow you to go down to minutes that you can see here. I can go down to minutes, but from a best practice and a recommendation standpoint, it's important to note that these jobs take time to run. So even if you set this up to run every 1 minute, you might think that you're getting something that's near real time, but these jobs often take 5 minutes or more, depending on the volume of data that you're copying. So it would always be behind. It takes however long it takes to run that job. And if you're running it every 1 minute, it's probably really only going to run like every 4 to 5 minutes. Depends on the entity again and the volume of data that you're working with. But it's really intended to be asynchronous and not like a running it every single minute type of scenario. Excuse me. So at this point in our scenario, we're ready to go ahead and start processing our invoices. Theoretically, like I would have another integration that's coming back in to bring data back in from my my WMS system through data management or some other mechanism. But now we're ready to go ahead and start processing those invoices. So I've got a short video here that I'm going to play that kind of shows you this. So here we are in Powerapps, and we're using the AI Builder. We've created a model that is able to scan and use cognitive services to get that OCR metadata off of my invoices. And here you can see the Canvas app. So we built out a Canvas app that is embedded, and you'll see that a little bit later, into finance and operations. And it has a number of pages to this app where you can configure some details for new vendors. It has the pages where you can see the details of the actual vendor invoice. And now we're in finance and operations, and you can see we created a new workspace tile that opens up a full page Canvas app. We also embedded it a second way, so you can see that here. So once this is done, you can see we also put it into an existing workspace as a tab. So by using the kind of white background on the Canvas app and not using any special colors, that sort of thing, it gives that app the appearance that it's part of finance and operations, and the user can't tell that they're actually using a Canvas app. We'll be diving into this scenario more and talking through exactly how to embed these apps and best practices for designing apps. We'll also talk more about that AI Builder in the AI Builder portion or session later on. So now that I've kind of shown you the various different aspects here, what I want to do is kind of dissect a little bit and talk about the different scenarios and kind of what I did, how I made this happen. So starting out with dualwrite, so you saw just one piece that was using dualwrite in my demo today, but I've also got order to cash set up as well, which I didn't show. But in my case, I enabled dualwrite for the vendor entity. So that was it's a native entity that's already mapped out there. It exists in the common data service, so I didn't need to do anything special other than enable that entity for mapping. Once I enabled that entity for mapping, then I was able to go ahead and create my model-driven app. In my case, I didn't really need to do much to the views or forms for my vendor entity because it is a native entity in the common data service and already had all of those tabs and fields. So I didn't have to go through the process of designing that form, but I did have to add that entity into my sitemap so that it would show up on the navigation of my model-driven app. So when you're wanting to build a Power App that is using dualwrite, there's kind of two basic steps that you're going to follow. So you're going to have to configure your dualwrite, and then you're going to create that Power App. In my case, I did a model-driven app, but it could just as easily be a Canvas app. So when you're configuring dualwrite, you'll need to create and link your common data service, and then you can start enabling your entity maps. If you want to map entities that are custom and they aren't part of the out-of-the-box templates that are provided, you can do that as well. Down at the bottom, I've provided links for each of these different steps that are outlined here. So how to set up the dualwrite from LCS or for existing environments, and then how to enable those entity maps. Once you've done that, then you can start creating your Power App. So when you create your Power App, you're going to need to make a connection to your common data service, the same common data service that you are linking to for dualwrite. And then you can start to design your interface. Designing your interface really kind of consists of two key steps. One is creating those forms and views, which is done from the Power Apps Maker portal. And then the second piece of that is to create your sitemap, which is the screenshot that you see here on the right, where you need to go in and edit and add those entities and decide kind of what the layout of the application will look like. When you're finished, you'll need to save and publish your app. If you don't publish those changes, you won't be able to play and actually use the app. So it's really important that you remember those steps, and the links to do all of those basic steps are included here. So a couple of things to note about dualwrite and from a do's and don'ts perspective. So when we think about using dualwrite, we want to use dualwrite to duplicate data to the common data service or finance and operation when the data is expected by the business logic. If the business logic is not needed in two systems, or the business logic is not dependent on the data existing where the business logic lives, you don't need to use dualwrite. You're just going to be duplicating data and increasing capacity and your costs when that data isn't required. Many of the customer engagement scenarios, like the order to cash, are great examples of when you should use dualwrite, because there's business logic in Dynamics 365 Sales that relies on that business logic in the common data service. And we also rely on the business logic and the data inside of finance and operations. It's important to note that you'll want to consider your CDS API limits and multiplexing and order line SKU requirements if you're planning to use dualwrite. So if you're using dualwrite, we do give you an allowance of API limits that are specific. That you get an extra 400,000 API calls when you enable dualwrite with finance and operations, in addition to the API limits that you get with your common data service out of the box. But it's still important, depending on the volume of records that you're going to be integrating with dualwrite, those API limits do still apply. You'll also need to consider multiplexing in those order line SKU requirements. If you're pulling into one of the 6 entities that are outlined in the licensing guide, it might be required that you either license the users on both the CDS or customer engagement app and in F&O, or that you purchase order line SKUs so that your production hardware is scaled correctly to support the volume of integrations and data that will be going through it. You'll also need to consider your CDS database size and procure add-ons if needed. So obviously your F&O database needs to be considered as well, but when you use dualwrite, you are copying that data into the CDS and will need to make sure that it is sized correctly based on those needs. Some things not to do with dualwrite is to use it to duplicate data where your business logic is only needed in one of those systems, or where your business logic is going to be added into a Power App or Power Automate. So if you're going to build the business logic into your app, then we don't necessarily have a requirement or a dependency on that data existing, because I can query that data using virtual entities, and that would be a more cost-effective way. So, consider to only use dualwrite when that data is really needed by the business logic that you're writing. So switching gears to the virtual entities, for the demo, there were a number of different things that you saw that were specific to using virtual entities. So I started out by deploying the partner portal sample. Again, you could have installed the solution for the supplier management portal as well. And the list of virtual entities that I enabled here, this is not all inclusive. There were some additional entities, but the key ones were the prospective vendor registration request entity. I also enabled the request for a quotation line and header entities for the published, Perch published RFQs. If I wanted to kind of extend that scenario and do my vendor invoice or vendor payments, I would need to find the appropriate entities and publish those out as well. On my CDS entities, so each one of these entities that I enabled, I needed to create new views and new main forms. And you could make brand new views, or you can edit the existing views. It doesn't really matter which approach you take. In some cases, I edited the existing views and added more fields. When you enable that virtual entity in the Common Data Service, it creates a view and a form for you. However, it only puts like the key, like whatever the key is for that particular entity, into the form and into the view. And oftentimes those keys aren't very useful. So you will pretty much always need to go update your forms and views, but it's a very quick and easy drag and drop experience. Once I had done that, I was ready to create my portal and my model-driven app. So because I deployed the portal at the beginning, I was able to go create a new page for my bids. And in my case, I made a single page and I put the bids and the prospective vendor registration into the same page. Basically, when you create those pages in the properties pane on the right-hand side, you're just selecting the views and forms that you created directly in the CDS. And I was using the studio to create mine, which makes that experience easier. And if it's your first time creating a portal, I do strongly recommend using the studio because it's a bit more simplified. When you get more advanced, then you're going to want to go into the kind of the back office side, if you will, of the portal. And you'll have a lot more granular control over the behavior of those pages, the look and appearance. With my model-driven app, I needed to create the app first, and then I made a sitemap for the pages. Because I had already created the views and forms that I wanted on my CDS entity, all I needed to do was add those into my sitemap. So that was a quick and easy process. So when we think about the flows, and I did two different flows, which I actually didn't show, but I've got screenshots here for you that you can see. I have the ability to use inbound Power Automates with virtual entities. So if you want to do this, first you have to enable your virtual entities in the Common Data Service, and then you can create a flow. Once you've created a flow, you'll need to make a connection to one or more things. So in my case, you'll need to add a connection to your common data service. But it's important to note from an inbound perspective that something else needs to be the trigger. So in my case, I did an email. So when an email arrives in a shared inbox, I've got a number of different parameters there. I'm pulling those in and saying, oh, go create a record in my virtual entity. Or, maybe I route that to someone to perform a review process, whatever it might be. There's no limit to really what you can do. The key is you need a trigger of when something happens, and then you can say connect to the common data service, and you'll select your virtual entity from the list just like you do any other entity, and you'll know it's a virtual entity because it will say MSERP in parentheses at the end. I have, again, put links down here at the bottom for all of the various different steps that would be involved in creating a new Power Automate for this. So if you're not familiar, I encourage you to check out the steps, but we'll be talking more about Power Automate and how to create flows in future sessions as well. For the outbound example of the Power Automate that was using virtual entities in my example, you're going to start by creating a flow, and the trigger for your flow is going to be a business event. At this point, that business event is the finance and operations business event. At some point, we will have new business event capabilities inside of the common data service, but for now, you have to use the when a business event occurs in finance and operations. Then the additional steps that you put in here can be really anything you want. In my example, it might be a little bit hard to see, but I parsed the JSON, which is pretty typical, so that you can kind of get all the values that were passed from that business event out. And then in my case, I needed to look up the record to get some additional fields from that CDS entity. So I used a list records in action in Power Automate and filtered that down to just be the vendor invoice and the vendor account that I passed in from that particular vendor. So what I was doing was I was looking up the vendor so I could get the email address, because the email address isn't stored on the invoice itself and not passed in here. So I needed to look that up. And then I set a variable. I initialized a variable. And then for each invoice email address that I find, I'm looping through those. In my case, I filtered it down so it would only ever find one, but it doesn't know that. So it uses an apply to each. And then I send an email to the vendor to whatever email address I looked up, and letting them know, hey, we processed your invoice, or we processed your payment, whatever, your business event trigger is. And here's a link to go get to the portal. Again, the links to do that are found here. So some do's and don'ts for your virtual entities. You do want to use virtual entities where your business logic resides in finance and operations. So if all of your logic that you need to execute is over in finance and operations, and we don't need to, have additional business logic where the data is required in the common data service or in CE, virtual entities are a good candidate. You do want to use virtual entities as well when you plan to extend or add business logic in a Power App or Power Automate. So you can put additional business logic in your app or your Automate to tell it, oh, go do this approval process and then go insert a record or change the status of a record inside of finance and operations. It's important that you'll want to relate your virtual entities to each other. So if you need to relate one virtual entity to another virtual entity, you'll do that in F&O directly on the entity. So you'll make an extension to that entity, or if you've created a brand new entity, you can do it directly on there. Those relationships are dependent on the actual relationship on the entity. You'll also want to relate virtual entities to other native entities that are in the CDS with X++ extensions. So right now, this is the only way to do that. There is some new functionality on the roadmap that will create a user interface to make this process easier. But as of right now, you need to create an X++ extension if you want to relate a native entity to a virtual entity. And that's done directly in finance and operations. Some things that you should not do is virtual entities are not a data copy mechanism. It's just querying that data, and the data will always reside in F&O. You don't want to use virtual entities when additional data points are needed. So it's not appropriate to enable a virtual entity and then go into the Common Data Service and add a couple of fields to that entity. Now, if you needed to make a new entity entirely in the CDS that has additional fields that are somehow related, you could do that. Just remember, you need to relate those native entities to virtual entities via the X++ extensions. And we should not attempt to relate one virtual entity to another virtual entity directly in the Common Data Service. All right, so switching gears to the data integrator, a couple of things for the demo. So I created a connection, which is, in my case, I connected to finance and operations and another CDS, but this could have been another source that's supported. So, one of the most common other examples would be like a SQL server. For the next thing I did was I needed to create a project. And in my case, I chose the template that is for F&O to the CDS template. Then you can start to create maps. In my case, I mapped the products, the purchase order header, and purchase order lines with a handful of fields. Obviously, you can map as many entities and fields as are needed for your particular integration. And then you'll set up that scheduling. In my case, I set up that execution to be a nightly recurrence. So the basic steps, the 6 steps, are making the connection set, the project, selecting the template, mapping your entities, mapping your fields, and then configuring the recurrence. The links to do each of those steps are provided down here at the bottom. And I've also provided a link for error management and troubleshooting. So if you do run into errors or problems with your data integrator, you can use this resource to help you troubleshoot any mapping errors or issues that you might have with your data integrator. Couple of do's and don'ts for your data integrator. You absolutely should use it as an integration approach. It's intended for large volumes of data that do need to be copied to another system. It's not appropriate to use data integrator when you need near real-time or synchronous processing. If you need near real-time or synchronous processing, you're going to want to look to another technology. If you have high volumes, dualwrite may not be the right answer, so you may need to look at doing something else with like an Azure Service Bus or some other technology, a real-time web service or something like that. Obviously, your business requirements will dictate what's most appropriate, but these are the considerations that you'll want to make. So the key takeaways, if you fell asleep halfway through my demo or my presentation, the 4 things that you need to remember is dualwrite, data integrator, and virtual entities are meant to coexist. None of these features are replacing each other. And you can use dualwrite when the business logic relies on the existing data and you intend to copy that data. You're going to use your data integrator for your high volume scenarios, and the virtual entities are there to query and perform those CRUD operations with F&O, and the business logic just exists in F&O. That wraps up what I wanted to share with you today. I do encourage you to make sure that you're registered for the upcoming sessions. I've got the next 4 up here on the screen for you that are happening over the next month or so. And with that, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Okay, so it looks like we do have a question. What's the difference between the vendor collaboration portal, which already exists in F&O, and the one that is available through Power Portal? Great question. So the vendor collaboration portal, it's important to note the user interface of that is actually the finance and operations user interface, and we're surfacing various forms inside of F&O to those users. It only supports authenticated users, so you have to have a user account to be able to log in and use those vendor portal capabilities. There is no concept of a public portal. What I demonstrated for you today was primarily around the public portal portion of that. So you could, and it's also important to note that the portal that I demonstrated for you today is not an out-of-the-box solution. I actually built that. So I deployed the partner portal, and then I started editing and tweaking that to make it into a vendor portal. The supplier management portal that's available as a solution out there is also available. It has some additional capabilities, but those are just samples. They're not like fully baked solutions that have end-to-end capabilities. So you'll need to do customization to those portals no matter what. So hopefully that answers the question. Do we have any other questions that have not been answered that we need to address, Jeff, or questions that came up that we maybe did answer that we want to review?
Yeah, one of the common questions that's come up is which entities are available through virtual entity. It's all the entities in finance and operations that are marked as is public equals yes. So in finance and operations, that's how you control whether or not an entity is available to OData. And basically all the entities that are available to OData by having is public equals yes set on them, those are the ones that show up for virtual entity. I'll note that I say virtually all of them because there are a couple of minor exceptions that are documented on docs.microsoft.com. For instance, you couldn't use a entity which is backed by a union view in F&O through virtual entity because there's no proper ID field on those entities. There's no way to uniquely identify records that come out of it. So there's a couple of those real edge cases that knock out like 1% of the entities as not being available. But the vast majority of the OData entities are usable through virtual entity.
Thanks, Jeff. I saw another one that was asking about additional licensing costs to stand up a CDS environment if you already have a FinOps subscription. So if you already have finance and operations, one common data service is included with your licensing. You can deploy that. If you don't have one already, you can deploy that directly through LCS. If you need a second CDS, for development or testing purposes, which is generally recommended, you don't want to just have a production CDS and no other CDSs. If you're doing a lot of development work there, you can procure additional common data service capacity through the add-on SKU, and you can work with your partner or your license reseller to get more information on that.
Another question which has been asked a couple of times is about application lifecycle management and how we deal with multi-instance and things like that. Broadly, what we would guide people there is think of your CDS and F&O environments as converging into a single environment. So a lot of the gestures you can do, like a lot of the ALM, a lot of the management of the environment is converging around a one-to-one view of an environment. So don't think of this where you would have a CDS hub with a bunch of F&O spokes or vice versa. An environment over time becomes an environment that just happens to have a bunch of applications installed in that environment. And in addition to that, if you wanted to then integrate multiple environments together, that's where things like dataintegrator become a tool that you would want to look at, doing more of an arm's length integration between multiple environments.
Another question came in: if we develop any solution as portal using virtual entities, will there be any license issue from D365 Finance and Operations? So there's a lot of caveats to this question. It depends on what you're building your portal to do. If you create a portal for your call center users to submit sales orders, to create sales orders because you want to make a more simplified user interface, for example, those users would need to be licensed for finance and operations. That would be a multiplexing scenario. If you're building a portal like the example that we looked at today for vendors to be external, that does not fall under a multiplexing scenario, and your vendors are not required to be licensed for the portal. But if you have vendors that are logging into your system to act on behalf of your organization, like consultants or something like that, that you contract them out through a vendor, and they're going to be updating projects and doing timesheets and other things like that, that would also fall under a multiplexing scenario. I would encourage you to consult with the licensing guide and talk with your partner and your licensing reseller, or your sales specialist at Microsoft. They can definitely give you more details about your specific scenario to let you know if there's a conflict. You know, it's really going to come down to multiplexing and dual use rights type scenarios.
There's a question about being able to use virtual entities in customer engagement dashboards. Yes, that is a scenario that's fully supported. That's actually one of the key drivers for why we've enabled virtual entity, both within model-driven apps or UCI apps on CDS, as well as Canvas-based apps, the more traditional Powerapps. You can mix and match both native entities from CDS as well as virtual entities from finance and operations. We have a number of scenarios where various partners and customers are doing things where you'll start from some native entities, like looking at your accounts and contacts, which may have been dual written from F&O over to CDS, and then drill deeper into, say, some transactional information related to those accounts and contacts via virtual entity, so that you can view some of that transactional information, which is so verbose that you would never be able to copy it back and forth with dualwrite. So in these ways, both dualwrite and virtual entity are complementary and compatible technologies that light up additional scenarios when you use them together.
All right, I think we have time for one last question and then we'll wrap up. Do we have any free version of CDS available for developer to explore? There is a trial version of the Common Data Service that you can sign up for. The link for that is in the appendix of our PowerPoint deck, but a quick internet search should also probably land you on that page as well if you want to get started on that immediately. So you can sign up for those trial environments. They're good for 30 days, and then you can start playing around with it. With that, I thank everyone again for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Evan to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. We'd like to get your feedback on today's session. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. The survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.